beach in a grey January day. Low cloud cover and the possibility of meeting with a Messerschmitt lost in the clouds forced to fly the plane at a low altitude. Having made a circle over the forest, Po-2 goes to land, a short jolt at contact with the ground, and, sweeping a plume of Pozemka, the plane runs on the runway of the field airfield. Here is the farm Vasily Ivanovich Dymakhenko, commander of the bomber regiment. We taxi to the edge of the forest. Having put the car in a shelter, we are heading along a trampled path to a small house where the regiment's CP is located. 3 men are walking towards us with quick steps in front of Major Dymchenko, a dense, broad-shouldered man with traces of burns on his face. Next to him is Deputy Major Petrov and Chief of Staff Lieutenant Colonel Kul. These people I have known for a long time. I have not once had to visit them at the field airfields and in the regiments, but then I flew as a representative of the headquarters of the Air Army. Today they receive me as a division commander, their immediate superior. At the airfield is the usual frontline life. In the shelters near the planes fussing technicians and pilots. There is an inspection of aircraft. Nearby armourers remove long, heavy bombs from cars and hang them in the hatches. Scene part is preparing for a combat flight. From time to time from the runway and the winter skies soared into the winter sky scout planes. Having made a circle over the forest, they are carried away to the west. Having received a report from Dymchenko, together with him and Petrov, we are going to the places where the planes are parked. Since the last time I was at Dymchenko, the composition of pilots in his regiment has changed. Some moved to other units for promotion. Others went to the hospital. Others fell in battle to the death of the brave. They were replaced by new people, and I wanted to get acquainted with them directly at the planes. In a small clearing, in the Cavanier, the plane of Captain Grishin. Grishin, squadron commander, one of the best pilots of the division. We met him at the plane. In a black fur jacket and moved to the back of the cap, he and his technicians were checking the readiness of the machine for flight. Noticing us, the captain wiped his hands, came up and, minting words, reported that the squadron was preparing to perform another mission. I had learned about the fact that the regiment was to raid a railroad station from the former division commander, General Vladimir Alexeyevich Yushakov, and now I was watching the personnel of the regiment preparing for a difficult combat mission. That day I got to know many people of the regiment better, with Lieutenant Petrov, the flight commander, with young, full of combat enthusiasm, Junior Lieutenant Arkhipov. The regiment commander also introduced me to Lieutenant Baranov, the brave scout of the regiment, who was known in the regiment as a brave air fighter, who was able to get information about the enemy in the most difficult conditions of the combat situation. At one of the airplanes my attention was attracted by a loud conversation. 2 people were talking. "Why do you, your pikey soul, again on alarm, forget things in the dugout? You think there are babysitters here for you?" one of them said menacingly. "Take your mitt." "I don't need them today, comrade petty officer. My hands are sweaty without them. I left them in the dugout to dry out," justified the cold falsetto. We went around the airplane and saw the petty officer shoving the mittens into the hands of the junior sergeant. "Oh, take them, I say, ugly girl, if I order you to, or you'll frostbite your fingers." The petty officer's voice is full of love and care for his comrade. They are old friends, Marf Vasily Ivanovich. Petty Officer Surofonchenko is a scary man, especially for his friend. The guy has golden hands and work capacity that knows no bounds. Having talked with the petty officer and his friend, we went further. In 3 hours, Vasily Ivanovich led me along an old forest path to a house on the edge of the forest, and from here to the village where his headquarters was located. Having shaken off the snow in the haylofts, we entered the room, the office of the Chief of Staff. It was a small room, wallpapered with gold flowers scattered on a bluish-green field. To the left, near the wall, a camp bunk covered with a grey soldier's blanket. It is often slept on by newcomers, and the owner usually either settles down on the floor with his fur overalls under his side, or goes into the next room to a vacant bunk. By the window is a table with a map penciled on it. In the corner, a chest with documents. That's all the front furniture. When we entered, Nikolai Yakovlevich Kulin put on the map the situation, just received from the higher headquarters. I had known Nikolai Yakovlevich for about 18 years. From the time when we were still cadets at the flight school, there was basically nothing new. Both sides continued to improve their positions. Our troops were preparing for an offensive on Jatsk and, probing the enemy defense, fought local battles. based on the general situation of the franchise, determined and the actions of aviation, our pawns, as the pilots affectionately called their new planes P2, acting at altitudes of 200-400 meters by individual crews and small groups, bombed railroads and highways in the following areas: Vyazma, Smolensk, Spastamensk, Lyudinovo. Frequent raids of our pilots on the railroad stations Semlevo, Volostu, Piatnitsa, Alferovo, Tumanovo and Doroguj caused considerable damage to the enemy. Dozens of warehouses with ammunition and food, echelons with troops and military cargoes were destroyed in those days. We managed to a great extent to paralyze in the daytime and country roads. Hitlerites were forced to bring ammunition and food to the front line exclusively at night or in inclement weather, when our pilots were sitting at the airfield, cursing the weather. There was a lot of work in those days, and everyone worked hard. Returning to the base after a combat mission, the pilots ran to the canteen and, having hastily grabbed a bowl of fiery borscht, returned to the aircraft. During this time, technicians had time to inspect the planes and engines, repair minor damage sustained in combat, and gunners hung a new supply of bombs. After that, the crew was on its way to fulfill the combat mission. As a reminder of those hot battles of meetings with death, the pilots had traces of wounds and burns. From that time and burns on the face of the regiment commander Vasily Ivanovich Demchenko. Everyone in the regiment knows about how he got them, from the pilot to the cook and waitress of the regimental canteen, red-cheeked, cheerful girl Katusha. The case was like this. It was October 1941. Tank and motorized divisions of the enemy were rushing to Moscow. On the Warsaw Highway stretched eastward endless columns of Hitlerites. A mass of tanks, trucks with infantry, tanks were piled up near the bridge over Ugra. Dimkut Squadron was ordered to bomb the enemy columns in this area. The squadron took off without cover and took a course to the west. The enemy met the Soviet planes with anti-aircraft fire, but Navigator Kreskov accurately led the squadron on a combat course. The first approach. Bombers dropped bombs. At the bridge, towering columns of explosions. Here and there were fires. Making a new approach, Soviet pilots combed the approaches to the bridge, firing machine guns at enemy tanks. Dimchenko noticed that he was attacked by 6 Me-100. Connect. The officer gave a command to his comrades. Attack Messerschmitts. There was a fierce fight. Our gunners' radiators met fascist fighters with friendly fire. The first enemy plane burst into flames and crashed into the forest. Almost simultaneously with him, Smoke and right wingman Dimchenko, the plane burst into flames. The crew had to descend on parachutes. The fight continues. Messerschmitts attack actively, feeling their superiority. A new attack and a machine gun line riddled the dashboard on the airplane Dimchenko. Broken gas tank. Go down. Dimchenko commanded his left wingman. Get close to the forest and go away. I'm on fire. The pilot quickly carried out the commander's order. In a minute he disappeared behind the forest. Dimchenko made a sharp turn. The altitude was falling catastrophically. The forest was surging. A moment more, and the plane, cutting off the planes of the tops of young trees, fell to the ground. It was all over. Waking up after the fall, Dimchenko, lurching and groaning, climbed out of the cockpit and pulled out the flame-covered navigator. Both crawled away from the plane in the bushes and began to make bandages. The navigator's ears and hair were burned. When the wounded was well camouflaged, Dimchenko ordered the gunner Radio Colin to go to the plane and keep watch, and himself stayed near Krustkov. Tolin ran away. Left alone, Dimchenko went for the map. At that moment, 2 guys came to the edge of the forest. Dimchenko called them, but the boys remained in place, scrutinizing the pilot. "Who are you?" one of them shouted at last. "Germans or ours?" "Hey, mother of my mother," Dimchenko burst out. "One does not recognize one's own?" Hearing the Russian speech, the guys ran up and immediately informed the officer that the Nazis were looking for the downed airplane. "But you, uncle, you have to leave." "Wait a minute." Both jumped up and disappeared behind the trees. Tolin came back. The pilots, lifting Krustkov, went a little deeper into the forest and waited. Time passed languidly long. Half an hour passed, but here among the trees glimmered women's dresses. It was the boys who had brought their teacher and her daughter. Both of them were watching the falling Soviet airplane from the village. As soon as the children told them where it was, Alexandra Gavrilovna Dobrokotova and her daughter Rita went to help the pilots. The teacher immediately sent Rita to fetch a horse and stayed in the forest. She returned late in the evening. Kristkov, Dimchenko and Kolin were put on a cart, through hay and brought to the village. There was no doctor here, only a veterinarian. We had to call him. He came and gave the pilots first medical aid. At night, Alexandra Gavrilovna took Dimchenko and his comrades out of the village. A few days later, they arrived in Medin, where there were Soviet troops. Hotly thanked the pilots Alexandra Gavrilovna and Rita for the rescue. Later it became known that during the hard days of retreat, the Soviet patriots Dobrokotovs saved the lives of many Soviet fighters and commanders. For courage and bravery, by the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, mother and daughter Dobrokotovs were awarded Alexandra Gavrilovna the Order of the Patriotic War, and her daughter Rita the Order of the Red Star. This story about the rescue of the crew of a Soviet bomber in general outlines I knew long ago. But here in the regiment, I was told about everything in more detail, as they say, in all the details. I heard it, of course, not from Vasily Ivanovich himself, but from his co-workers, in particular, from the regiment's vice policeman, Major Petrov. Having learned about our conversation, Dichenko grumbled for a long time that he didn't need publicity, and that nothing special had happened. And if anyone showed heroism in this case, it was not him, but his comrades, and first of all the teacher Dobrokotova and her daughter Rita. However, no one paid attention to his cooing. Everyone knew perfectly well the major's modesty. In the evening I said goodbye to Dimchenko and flew to get acquainted with other regiments of the division. February 1943. After mighty blows of the Soviet armies on the Volga and in the Caucasus, Hitlerite defense cracked at all seams from sea to sea. 1,000-kilometer front came in motion. More and more often we caught on the radio hysterical cries of Hitler's agitators about bitter frosts in Russia, about the necessity to equalize the front for reasons of strategic order invented by the genius of Hitler's general staff. Again leveled, smiling, reported to me the head of the operational department in the morning, pulling out another Inform Bureau report and information about the results of air reconnaissance. What can you do? You'll have to equalize when you're driven in the neck. I laughed in response and began to study the situation. This information that we received in those days from our scouts were comforting. The enemy was retreating in many directions. In February, he began to withdraw, and on our section of the front, returning one day from a combat mission, the best divisional scout, Junior Lieutenant Asimov, reported that he saw on the roads leading to the front large columns of vehicles. The courageous pilot flew over some of them at a strafing flight to clarify what kind of vehicles were coming, empty or loaded. On the cars going to the rear of the enemy, the bodies and trailers were filled with various goodies. Doubts were over. The enemy was withdrawing, taking with him the looted property of the Soviet people. The scout's report was so stunning that we did not immediately believe in the accuracy of his observations, but the pictures taken by the officer said that it was exactly so. At dawn the next day, the division received an order from the headquarters of the Air Army to put planes in the air and prevent the systematic retreat of the Nazis, thus helping the ground troops to develop the offensive on our section of the front. In the afternoon, the commander of the 1st Air Army, Lieutenant General Sergei E. Alexandrovich Kudikov, flew to the division on his staff plane. Small stature, lively, energetic, with brilliant brown eyes, he was able from the very first minute of acquaintance to charm a person, to instill in him confidence in his abilities, to inspire him to a feat, not without reason in the army, which he commanded, in the courageous and brave people were never lacking. Well, Eagles, he greeted the pilots as soon as the rumble of the propeller of his limousine Po-2 was silent. A stomp, then, Hitlerites on the winter paths, not having bread. It is necessary to see them off, as it is supposed to good hosts, with goodbye gifts, bombochka, so that they would know how to enter someone else's house uninvited. A kick in the knee, so they'll always remember. And he made a vigorous movement of his leg, as if giving an invisible opponent a kick in the ass. The pilots laughed. There will be no stopping for us, Comrade Commander. Well then, let's begin. The general concluded this impromptu meeting. Let's go to the headquarters to get the situation. Hot days came. All this time, the airfields lived a full-blooded combat life. Every day in the morning, the crews went up into the blue or grey sky and hid in the west. After a while, they would return, quickly steering the airplanes into cover. Here, the technicians quickly refueled the machines and hung the next portion of deadly metal in the bomb hatch. After that, the crews took off again and went on bombing. And so all day long, from morning to evening. Pilots did not spare themselves, not giving a minute of rest to the enemy. These days brought us the joy of victories and acute bitterness of loss of friends. Many of the best pilots did not return to their airfields. Some of them died the death of heroes in the air battle with the enemy. Others had to descend to the territory occupied by the Nazis, and thereafter long wandering joined the partisan detachments. And only loners, the lucky ones, made their way across the front line and returned to the unit. On one of February days, I was informed that the flagship plane of my deputy hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Ivanovich Martinov, had not returned from a combat mission. The lieutenant colonel flew from the field airfield of one of the regiments of the division to him when navigator Major Grigory Ivanovich Armashov and gunner radiator petty officer Ivanov. This message stunned all of us. We knew these men well, and no one wanted to believe that they could have died. A day passed, the second, the third. Our radio operators were intensively catching German radio stations, hoping that the Nazis would boast that they had shot down a Soviet bomber. Usually they rang about their victories in the air to the whole world. But this time the enemy was silent, and we were lost in guessing what could have happened to our pilots. But on the seventh day, when all hope for the return of comrades were lost, from the headquarters of the Army of Ground Troops reported that in one of the regiments are Martinov and Navigator. For the pilots were immediately sent 2 airplanes from the division control unit. In an hour and a half, Lieutenants Kokemesov and Martishin delivered the missing men to us, to Kondrovo. We gasped when our comrades entered the hut, where the headquarters was located. Frostbitten, burned, swollen from hunger, they seemed to come from the other side of the world. Armashov was especially terrible, pale, overgrown with a thick beard, with deep-set eyes. In a few minutes, the hut was packed with people. Everyone wanted to see their comrades alive and unharmed, to know how they managed to escape from the clutches of death. The chain of command went to hell. My room became a club. Everything that Martinov told that evening, sitting on my bunk, was so heroic, so revealed the character of the Russian man, his courage and heroism, that I will try to tell about what happened, as detailed as I heard myself. That day, the flagship plane of the compound, piloted by Martinov, having taken off last from the airfield, took its place in the line of the trailing 9 of the regiment. In the flagship's logbook there was a record, the regiments gathering along the linear landmark, going from the airfield to the front line, passed quickly and clearly. The formidable airship sailed under the very edge of grey-layered clouds. Martinov and Armashov carefully controlled the accuracy of flight regiments to the target. Bombers were gaining altitude. Under the wings of airplanes lay the war-scarred Bryansk region. Slowly floated back wide forest, snow-covered glades with villages pressed against the forest. Here was a deserted strip of the front line, zigzags of trenches and wire fences, hillocks of bunkers. And finally, the land occupied by the enemy. Into the column of bombers, Hitlerites met with strong anti-aircraft fire. But so far there were no losses. There were a few seconds left before the start of bombing. Armashov turned on the camera to photograph the results of the bombing. The target is covered. The navigator of the lead 9 reported by radio to the control center of the compound that the bombing strike was carried out accurately and in a timely manner. That day I twice asked the headquarters of the Air Army to allocate fighters for direct cover, but I received an order to fly out, with the explanation that the area of our combat operations would be covered. We knew that there were not enough fighters. Taking advantage of the fact that there was no direct cover, Messerschmitts at high speed attacked 9 Soviet bombers. At this time, Martinov dive-bombed the target. The bombs whistling flew downward. Dropping the bomb load, the crew failed to fight back, and a trio of enemy fighters set the plane on fire. The machine burst into flames, but Martinov still decided to reach his own. He leveled the plane and drove it to the east. However, the altitude inexorably fell, and the flames flared up. All the pilot's attempts to shoot it down were unsuccessful, but the front line is not far away. A little more, and he will sit down to his own. At the last moment, the plane, as if tripped over a bump, shuddered and went down. The pilot had time only to put under the wing to soften the fall of the burning machine to the ground. Waking up, Martinov looked around. Above his head, very low past the enemy fighter, a sheaf of bullets missed. The radio operator was good, heard Armashov's voice. He managed to jump out. Where is he now? Looking ahead, let's say that the gunner radio operator Ivanov, who jumped out with a parachute, was wandering in the woods for 3 days. Hungry and frozen, he came to the village. Here he was captured by fascists and sent to a camp for prisoners of war. The foreman stayed in the camp for 4 months, and when he was transported to Bobruisk, he escaped from the train and got to the Belarusian partisans. With their help, he returned to his unit. Finding himself on the ground, Martinov bandaged the navigator. Then the pilots spurned parachutes and hurried to go deeper into the forest. After walking about 2 kilometers, they sat down and began to count the property. The supplies were not so great. 2 tablets with maps, 2 TT pistols with 2 sets of ammunition, a pair of compasses, a pocket lantern, a box of matches, 4 cigarettes in Martinov's cigarette case. That's all. The onboard rations were burned. A sad, hungry life lay ahead. Despite the seemingly hopeless situation, the pilots did not lose their vigor. We will fight our way to our own. They decided, captivity is not for us, communists, and both of them walked on. The sky was dropping light fluffs of snow. Driven by the wind, they fell on the faces of the pilots, wet with sweat. Soon the officers came to a beaten path. Armashov suggested leaving along the path to cover their tracks completely. They walked about 200 meters. Then they saw that the path turned sharply to the left. We stopped. We began. At that time, they heard shouts around the corner and a machine gun burst. The pilots jumped aside and took cover behind thick tree trunks. A few minutes later, 5 Hitlerites ran past them on the path, breathing heavily. They were heading towards the burning airplane. But now they disappeared behind the trees and everything went quiet. Having consulted, the pilots decided to stay in the spruce forest and at night to move by compass to the rear of the enemy. 2 options were worked out. The first one was to sneak to the partisans in the Bryansk forests, which was not an easy task given the extremely light food ration of the officers. Besides, there was open terrain ahead. Here they could be spotted by the enemy. The second option was better, to pass through the front line in the area west of Dominici, where, according to Martinov's assumption, the enemy's defense in the dense forest was not solid. We approved the second option and began to prepare for the passage. But here on the path again appeared fascist machine gunners. Returning from the airplane, they walked slowly, holding automatic rifles at the ready. Without stopping, the soldiers walked past. The pilots sighed, "It's gone." By night, a snowstorm had broken out. The forest was smoking with snow dust. Spiky snowflakes crashed into the face. Somewhere in the distance, to the right or to the left, one could hear the deafening bursts of shells and mines, so the crackle of machine guns. The pilots followed the compass. Ahead of the clearing, 1/2 kilometer of open space. They lay down and crawled on a crawl. Twilight helped. In 2 hours, Martinov and Armashov crawled to the woods and burrowed under the bushes in the snow. Almost all night, the pilots did not sleep a wink, lying in their unreliable shelter. They lay there, and the whole next day. Hunger made itself felt strongly. As darkness fell, the officers tightened their belts and set off again. For a long time, they waded through the snowdrifts, breaking through the blizzard. In the darkness, they almost ran into an enemy sentry. Good thing he heard the rustle and shouted. The pilots froze in place and drew their pistols, but the sentry, seeing no one, calmed down and began pacing around the dugout again. When he disappeared around the corner, Martinov whispered quietly to Armashov, "At the second coming of the sentry behind the dugout, we leave immediately." The German, bypassing the dugout, again appeared before the eyes of the pilots and then again hid behind the dugout. Without wasting a minute, the officers began to cautiously crawl away. Finding themselves behind the far trees, they, ducking, ran into the forest. On the way they came across a telephone wire. With anger they cut it off. Let the fascists talk now. An hour passed, and the pilots, sneaking through the forest, again heard the German conversation. Around was the enemy. Again they had to camouflage in the snow. This time they burrowed under a fallen pine tree and threw dead wood and snow on themselves. We lay there for another 24 hours. We withstood together with Hitlerites' bombing of our stormtroopers. They bombed great. The anti-aircraft battery of the enemy was completely destroyed. With the onset of new twilight, Martinov and Armashov went further. Hungry, exhausted, they continued to move forward. After midnight, the February blizzard began again. It seemed that the inhuman efforts of the 2 brave men were waste. They could not cope with the raging elements. but the men went against the elements. In sea into the town, they came across an abandoned dugout. By all signs, it was long forgotten by Hitlerites. But still, just in case, the pilots, having climbed into it, threw on themselves various junk. During this 24 hours, they slept by turns with nervous but strong sleep. Another evening came. Having honestly divided the third cigarette in half, Martinov and Armashov smoked. It was necessary to go on. By the dawn of the fifth day, they were already quite close to the front line, 3 kilometers away from them, on the other side of the swamp and small woods. There was a fierce battle. The pilots saw how clearly our Katyushas were working, how accurately the Soviet artillerymen were sending their shells. However, even here they did not manage to get to their own. They went further. The sixth day on the road. Late in the evening they got to the swamp. The seventh night came. It was snowing with drizzling rain. Our artillerymen were continuously firing at the enemy. Shells began to burst not far from the pilots. The friends fell to the bottom of the trench and sat in it until the firing stopped. Night, rain, tedious, cold, fascists are occasionally firing sporadically. Here and there rockets soared into the sky. 2 exhausted men are crawling between 2 wire fences. Here is no man's land, a neutral strip. Here is the river bank. Cautiously crawling 2 officers on the ice. Here are their barriers. Both start talking loudly so that the observers in our trenches will hear Russian speech and not fire. After sitting for a while, both got up and ran to their barriers. Here they were stopped by infantrymen. The combat opened his eyes wide when the soldiers brought him 2 pilots. What are you on the wings over the mines flew over? But the pilots did not answer any. They were dead tired. An hour later they were both taken to the headquarters of the rifle regiment and then by airplane here to us. March. Hot combat suffering does not subside. Bombing sorties continue at an ever-increasing pace. Now we are no longer as lonely and defenseless as in the first days of the war, when one bomber went on a combat mission without cover. The actions of our pilots are reliably supported by the fighters of General Zakharov's division. We have a particularly close relationship with the fighter regiment, which is commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Emelyevich Golubov. During this period, as a rule, not a single flight on a combat mission does not pass without the fact that we were not supported by his pilots. Joint combat work brought people closer together, soldered them into a single strong team. Close cooperation of fighters and bombers to minimize losses. We began to lose fewer people in combat. Golubov himself was a frequent guest in the division. Our pilots have already begun to consider him definitively their own. No Golubov, and as if someone is missing. However, there came a time when the 261st Air Regiment had to part with him temporarily. True, for a short time, but still. One day I was called to the apparatus. It was Major General of Aviation Pronin, Chief of Staff of our Air Army. Accept guests, he said. The edition is attached to the Squadron of Fighters Normandy. Familiarize pilots with the situation at the front with the techniques of enemy aces. From this day you will have your own guards, laughed into the tube general. And what about Golubov? We will have to be temporarily separated, joked the Chief of Staff of the Army. Nothing can be done. The war. Today, by the end of the day on the Lai-2, wait for people who are not part of the French crews, technicians, translators. Try to create decent conditions for them. Have a good day. I left the headquarters completely discouraged. It's a joke to say, by evening 1 batch of Frenchmen will arrive, by morning wait for the second one, and there's no time to create decent conditions for them. But I don't have to wait. I sit down in my Po-2 and fly from Kondrov to Polotyanty Zavod, to Dimchenko's airfield. He has better conditions for accommodating guests than in other regiments of the division. Markov's regiment stood then not far from the town of Yuknov, which had been defeated by the fascists. Osipenko's and Gavrilov's regiments, near the burned villages of Fatyanovo and Aduevo, and Kostyev's regiment, at some distance from was preparing young crews arriving for replenishment for combat. Vasily Ivanovich took the news of the arrival of the French with his usual calmness. Well, if it is necessary to accept, we will accept. If it is necessary to teach how to beat fascists, we will teach. If only they were good people, there's room for everyone in the war. He immediately called the commander of the Airfield Maintenance Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Shevchenko, and ordered him to prepare 2 houses on the edge of the forest to accommodate the guests. Here they will be most comfortable, he explained. We explained, and airplanes nearby. and to the canteen a short walk. And ours will be transferred to peasant houses. It's not bad there either. It didn't take long to persuade the pilots to move. Having learned that the houses are transferred to French comrades, they quickly packed their belongings and moved to the place of the new cantonment. In the remaining hours until evening, the soldiers put the huts in order, cleaned the floors, brought in iron bunks, covered them with soldiers' blankets. Our waitresses and liaison women also contributed to the common cause. Shell casings were taken from somewhere, paper flowers were made, white curtains were hung on the windows, and all this in just 2 or 3 hours. Truly, if a Russian man wants to receive guests, he himself will be smashed to bits, but he will receive them for real. As to whom, but to our Aho, the arrival of guests is only good for us, laughed Dimchenko, checking the work of housekeepers. Look how they cleaned up. The sun was already setting behind the jagged edge of the distant forest when the Laitu descended on the runway rowed by heavy rollers. He brought the first batch of Frenchmen. The first one who introduced himself to me was a doctor, a medium-sized, cheerful blonde man with a typical Russian face. On closer acquaintance, it turned out that he was really our compatriot. His parents had once emigrated to France. That's where Dr. Lebedynsky grew up and studied. Mon Colonel, he exclaimed excitedly, shaking my hand. How glad I am. Ah, how glad I am that I was fortunate to be able to defend my homeland from the enemy together with you. The doctor desperately mixed Russian words with French ones, but they did not lose their charm. The other Frenchmen were no less excited by both the warm welcome and the fact that they had finally arrived at the front. They were sufficiently fed up with sitting in distant Ivanovo and doing combat training instead of fighting for the honor of France. In the morning, the next day at no dawn, the familiar to all Po-2 of the commander of the Air Army, General Kudyakov, descended on the airfield of the Polotnienieni plant. I've come to check how prepared we are here, he said, laughing, pulling off his big leather cuffs from his hands. But no one believed in the check. Everyone knew that it was not this question that had raised the general in the air so early. He himself wanted to meet the young patriots of fighting France. The day of March was unusually fine. Light frost and spring sunshine, cumulus clouds running westward high in the sky. While waiting for guests, we stood at the edge of the forest and looked into the distance. For a long time, the horizon is empty. Finally, someone shouts. They're flying, they're flying. Excitement on the ground builds. How will the rendezvous happen? Will both sides immediately find that common language, establish a working contact so necessary in joint combat work at the front? What are the French pilots? These and many other questions, apparently, torment not only me. But now everyone sees the French. They're flying in threes, 5 links. On the approach to the airfield, they close ranks and fly in a tight formation. Now clearly visible are the national colours of the French banner, blue, white, red, in which the bark of the Soviet yaks are painted. Close formation in frontline conditions. What is it? Daring, boyishness, or high skill? Multiplied by the confidence that at any moment this formation will instantly disintegrate and the swift yaks will rush to the attack. I think and frown unhappily. No, look how good these Frenchmen are. I hear Kudyakov's voice nearby. Damn it, but it's just great. Masterful handwriting. You're lucky, Sergei Pavlovich. I don't know if I'm lucky or not, but so far there's nothing to criticize in the flying skills of the guests, and I'm admiring it along with everyone else. Comrade Colonel, the commander of the Normandy, Major Tulian, asks permission to land. He shouts to me on duty at the airfield. I authorize, I say, not taking my eyes off the airplanes going to the airfield. Exceptionally clear group formation, minimum allowable intervals and distances in flight, quick and accurate reorganization before landing approach, brilliant calculation and landing, the handwriting of the masters. The French have a strong grip, flashes in my head. A group of French pilots is heading towards us from the woods. In front, a short, tall, gaunt commander. This is the Major, Squadron Commander Jean-Louis Tillian. The formation stops near our group. A short wave of his hand to the helmet, and Major Tulian clearly reports on the arrival of the Squadron Normandy and my operational subordination. The report is over. A firm handshake and the official meeting is interrupted. Our pilots rush to the French. They shake hands firmly, kissing. Then, hugging each other, everyone goes to the dining room where a friendly lunch is prepared. It should be said that this time the hostesses have surpassed even themselves. Despite the difficult front conditions, the canteen is cleaned up as for a holiday. The tables have snow-white tablecloths. True, the service is different, but in my opinion, no one paid attention to it. The front 100 grams made the conversation lively. At first, the French, who were more vivacious and temperamental, spoke through interpreters, but no more than half an hour passed, and the interpreters were out of order. The pilots switched to sign language, a method of communication that seems to have been used since time immemorial in all corners of the world. It's the commonality of professions, excellent knowledge of business and technology, a common goal to which these people strived, made the impossible possible. A man who did not know his neighbor's language understood him perfectly. To make it more convincing, utensils were used. Knives, forks, salt shakers, plates turned into airplanes in the hands of the pilots, their own and the enemy's. They circled over the table, depicting air battles. Energetic gestures confirmed, told, passed on the experience of combat work, and no one thought about the fact that it all looked a little funny and naive. But the language of the heart was spoken here. Until midnight in the dining room reigned fun. In the evening the blizzard began to blizzard, and we were free from combat flights. And you, Sergei Pavlovich, they say you can play the accordion? Play something more cheerful for the youth. Kudyakov whispered to me. In a minute I had an accordion in my hands, slipped by someone's obliging hand. I had to shake the old days. I turned the furs and the loud sounds of a waltz filled the room. Instantly the couples swirled. The French, apparently, are still French everywhere. Before our guys could even blink an eye, the guests picked up the girls and twirled with them in a smooth dance. Waltz was replaced by a cheerful polka, then danced Russian and Gopak. Here our boys showed themselves. The guests only shrieked in amazement when the dancers made intricate tricks. No ours? At midnight I ordered to close the ball. With dawn began work on the airfield and maybe even combat flights. We went home with the pilots went to bed, and General Kudyakov and I talked for a long time about the people of France, who came to us to fight the common enemy on our land. Their fates had turned out differently before they came to us in the Soviet Union. The Normandy Squadron was formed in 1942, after receiving the consent of the Soviet Union to the active participation of French pilots in the battles on the Soviet-German front. Our country provided them with free-of-charge combat equipment and took over the supply of French pilots. The group arrived from Libya from the Rayak Air Base. The name of this airbase, patriotic pilots made their battle cry. Subsequently, over the Russian fields, in the skies of Belarusia and Lithuania, over the blazing cities of East Prussia, the French command sounded more than once. Rayak, forward. The first volunteers came from England and the Middle East. At the airfield they were met by Major Tulian, who later became the first commander of the Squadron Normandy, Captain Litolf and Major Pulican. Behind them, a trio of fugitives, or three musketeers, as they were called by the French, Albert Durand Lefebvre, and with them a 26-year-old Parisian Jacques-André. De la Poix joined them a little later, as well as Lieutenant Durand, Senior Lieutenant Beguian, Lieutenant Deville, Lieutenant de Saigny, and others. All these are brave, courageous guys, not sparing their lives to save the motherland. The thoughts and aspirations of these men were perfectly expressed by Major Tulian, who once said, "France lost the battle but did not lose the war. We have come here to prove it in practice." 15 men, 15 characters, 15 courageous hearts, ready to go to the feet and to death for the sake of their people, for the freedom and independence of their country. With such people we now had to act wing to wing and fight together for our victory. A ringing spring day. Ice caps are crunching affectionately underfoot. Overhead, among the archipelago of clouds, the airplane is slowly circling. From here, from the ground, it looks like a soaring kite, calmly and lazily describing clear circles over the bluish haze of the distant forest. The sun is beginning to warm up. By the Caponias in the calm, there are already puddles. Large oil stains float on the dark water. The snow near the bushes is blackened. Last year's dead grass has emerged on the bumps. Probably in a month the first snowdrops, the heralds of spring, will appear here. I walk along the dark path to the barracks where the French pilots are studying, and I think that in a week or two it will be necessary to change the camouflage. There are not many free hands for this work. Apparently, to help the maintenance battalion will have to throw and flight staff, excessive load on the officers, but nothing can be done. The situation strongly dictates its requirements. They cannot be neglected. It's the slightest omission, and you will pay for the blood of people, the loss of combat aircraft. I open the door to the barracks. a spacious room equipped as a classroom. All pilots usually study here, but today it was given to guests. The class is led by the navigator of the regiment Armashov. Teams on the board in front of the listeners, the scheme of the area of the upcoming actions. Blue winding ribbon Ugra. Behind it on the west bank stretch black teeth of enemy defences, fortifications, observation posts, behind the woods, firing positions of artillery and mortars. Further to the Dnieper, the woods pass into a solid forest massif. Behind it there are enemy airfields, Seshcha, Borovskoye, State Farm Dujino, Bryansk, places familiar to each of our pilots. Some of us flew there for bombing, others before the war lifted their airplanes from their runways. Now these airfields are used by the enemy. From here he makes raids on the front line of our troops. From here air pirates take off, heading for the bombing of Soviet cities. All this is now showing the French-Soviet navigator. Armashov tells interestingly, but the lesson does not stick. The French are half-voicedly talking among themselves. The thing is that our officer speaks Russian, then his words are translated by an interpreter. All this takes a lot of time. So far, looking at the bored faces of the pilots, it is easy to guess that they would gladly send to hell this kind of training and rush to the planes. During the break, I advise Armashov more resort to the scheme, to the drawing, to show on the models. The second hour is more lively. In the eyes of the French appeared in the light, there were lines, sprinkled with questions. French fighter pilots were concerned about many things. Turbulent, for example, was interested in the question, at what altitudes we fly, what is the system of defense in the air? Calm, imperturbable Leitotov several times insistently asked through an interpreter how we have a connection between fighters and bombers in combat, by radio or something else. Lively black-eyed May inquired about how the enemy objects are covered by anti-aircraft fire, where anti-aircraft facilities are located. Says French aviation captain Lefebvre was interested in how soon enemy fighters appear over the objects we attacked. There were a lot of questions because from the knowledge of the situation and the enemy's fighting techniques depended to live or die to win. That's why the French pilots were so thoroughly inquiring about the finest details of our guys' combat work. My appearance brought a new excitement in the class. Questions were sprinkled in my address. I had to tell the French about tactical methods of enemy fighters, i.e., about that part of the fascist aviation, which the Ryaks would have to face from the very first days of their combat activity. The conversation lasted until lunchtime. I told the newcomers about the cunning methods of fascist aces, how they distract our fighters, take them away from the bombers, and at this time other groups of Messerschmitts or Fokkers attack our planes. I did not have to go far for examples. Remember, Armashov, how fooled you fascist pilots last month? I nodded toward the major. 4 Messers attacked the Hawks. Well, those into battle and the Nazis did not get into the fight. They gave one burst from machine guns and scattered behind the woods. Ours followed them in the heat of the moment. It turned out that in a minute our bombers were without cover. Here we were attacked by enemy fighters, which at first went above us behind the clouds. By force we fought them off. It could have ended badly, but the Hawks came to their senses in time and returned. But it is not quite competent, mon colonel, interrupted me Tuyen. Maybe the major said something stronger to our fighters, but the translator translated it that way. No, tell the major, I asked, that in war there are not only feats but also mistakes. Mere mortals and heroes make them. But I wanted to make as few mistakes in the air as possible. The translation was apparently accurate, because the major was embarrassed and began to say something fast and quick to the interpreter. After a minute, the interpreter replied that Major Tyan asked to say that he did not want to offend or in any way reproach the valiant Russian aces. We shook hands and peace was concluded. After lunch at the French held classes at the head of intelligence, Major Polovinkin. He told the young pilots that on our section of the front operates fighter group Melders, which Hitler's command attached to his ground group center. The group contains the most trained Nazi pilots, the aces, who have a lot of air battles on their account. The message of the scout was received by the French with delight. "This is great," they shouted. "Ace, this is for us." The eyes of young Frenchmen sparkled. The excitement did not subside soon. All the following days in the barracks Normandy only and talk was that of the upcoming battles. Youth was bursting into the air to fight with the enemy. However, to be fair, it must be said that young Frenchmen did not find any special desire to accompany the Russian bombers. Each wanted to go on a free hunt, where the pilot is responsible only for his actions, for his life, and can fully show his combat skill, courage, and high-flying qualities. Such sentiments of our friends were little suited to the conditions of front life of that period. In those days, the enemy aviation was still strong, and the situation required not a free hunt for individual enemy pilots, but massive strikes of bomber aviation on airfields where it was possible to destroy at once dozens and hundreds of enemy aircraft. In addition, the bombers were assigned the task to make massive strikes on Hitlerite resistance nodes on the front line and on numerous columns of enemy vehicles bringing ammunition and food to the front. Therefore, the main thing that was required from the fighters was to support the bomber aviation during its raids on enemy targets. Of course, with such thoughts as the French had, there was nothing to think about the successful fulfillment of combat missions. We did our best to explain to the young pilots their mistake, to prove that their opinions are wrong. It was not easy to do this, because the French did not understand half a word of Russian, well, and we as much in French. And we with Colonel Dubrovin, my deputy on political part, sitting after a hard day of fighting in the headquarters, often puzzled over how best to do it. We argued a lot and for a long time. In disputes the truth was born, we found ways of work, and we did what sometimes seemed impossible, and I must say we did it well. Not without reason, later Jean-Louis Tullien often said that the Russian pilots taught the French to respect the tactics of their aviation, and that it was a pleasure to work in tandem with a Russian bomber. But while we achieved this recognition, we had to spoil a lot of each other's nerves. Day after day, and the difficulties gradually smoothed out, people leapt one to another, looked at the methods of work of each. Based on this, they built their work, created new methods, but more about it later. On the fourth day, I was torn away from the papers by a sharp call. It was Dimchenko. "No, comrade Colonel. The French strongly request to fly the planes in the airfield area and, by the way, to get acquainted with the nearest landmarks," wheezed in the tube. The request of the regiment commander caught me, as they call it, by surprise. I received a strict instruction from the army headquarters, without his permission not to let the French in the air unless it is not necessary. It is impossible to say that there was such a need, but people are urgently asking for it. "Wait, I say Dimchenko. In half an hour, call again. Maybe the situation will become clear." After talking to the regiment commander, I call the commander. I report, so and so. The French are asking for air. "Well, they say." He replies, "You try. But warn, let them go beyond the zone of the airfield hub. Not a step." I sigh with relief. One part of the problem is solved. Now, how to explain to French friends that they are obliged to accurately fulfill the instructions of the senior chief? I call Dimchenko, and as sternly as possible shout into the tube that the flight is allowed, but that everything was in order in the air. No fighting and no emergencies. "So warn me." Dimchenko obediently sighs into the tube, and I feel sorry for him. We both know that we demand the unthinkable. After all, enough to appear messers, and the French, forgetting all the instructions, will rush into battle. Would we do otherwise? The conversation was in the evening, and the next morning our French went up in the sky. The squadron commander, Major Jean-Louis Tullien, and Captain Albert Litolf. These guys were worth one another. The commander of the Normandy, Major Tullien, an experienced pilot, well mastered the technique of aerobatics. On his account, even before coming to Russia, was a few enemy planes shot down by him in the African skies. In his homeland, he graduated from the military school of St. Cyr and Versailles, flying school. After graduation, the young officer was sent to Libya, where he first met with Hitler's pilots. Thus, the first bits of combat experience Jean-Louis Tullien acquired even before arriving at the Soviet-German front. In nothing inferior to his commander-deputy Tullien, Captain Albert Litolf. This is a pilot of high class. He came to us, already having on his account a dozen of Nazi planes shot down by him. Among the French about the bravery and courage of Captain Litolf went many stories. He was admired and proud of old experienced air fighters and very green youth. This man gave all of himself to serve his country, and not without reason his life motto were the words of the famous French pilot Guillaume, "Nothing is given if everything is not given." And now both pilots are sitting in the cockpits of their airplanes ready to fly. The regiment commander gives the last admonitions, asks not to expose themselves to reckless risk. The conversation goes through an interpreter. Tulian smiles politely and nods his head as a sign that everything is clear to him. Timchenko approaches Litov's plane. The same conversation follows, the same warnings. In response, a friendly smile from Litov and a wave of his hand, shackled in a huge leather cuff. The engines roar like mad. A wave of the starter's flag and the yaks soared into the blue March sky, circle over the airfield, and they disappear behind the edge of the forest. The remaining pilots on the airfield scattered to their places. Now we can only wait to see how the first acquaintance of the French with the sky on our front will be. At first glance, it seems as if nothing happened here. Just 2 fighter pilots took to the sky. Such flights happen to us every day and many times. However, if one were to look closely at the people on the airfield now, the pilots, technicians and gunners, it would not be difficult to notice that the soldiers and officers were seriously worried about those who had flown away. Time was running out. The clock showed that the French pilots should have long ago returned to their airfield, and they are still not here. I do not let go of the handset and stormed on the phone airfield Timchenko, at the same time cursing myself for allowing these brave Frenchmen who were rushing into battle to take to the air on their own. It already seemed to me that the irreparable had happened. Running into the enemy pilots, they were both shot down or hit. If they were not killed in the air, then having descended by parachute, would be in a desperate situation on the ground. Well, where could 2 people in a foreign country go without knowing the language? Who would help them? Any Russian collective farmer would take them for Germans. I ordered Timchenko not to move away from the apparatus and to report immediately when airplanes appear. I'm listening myself. They are coming back. Ye. I hear a loud, joyful voice of Vasily Ivanovich. I want to know the details, but at this time called from the army headquarters. I pick up another phone. Now I think I'm going to get a scolding. Congratulations on the victory, Megichetia Kutikov's distant voice. What victory? I ask again. With the victory of your French. The ground searchers saw how they scooped up 8 misses. They said only feathers were falling. Give them the command's thanks for their courage and skill. The tube is silent. Yes, I was only able to pronounce. It was all so unexpected. I called Timchenko again. Now I find out all the details. It turns out that our 2 Frenchmen were quietly flying around their area, not thinking about any fight with enemy planes. But as they say on the Catcher and the Beast runs, above Ogre, they were unexpectedly attacked by Me-109s. Neither Tulian nor Litov were used to evade the battle. In the Soviet sky for the first time sounded a clear French command. Ryaki forward, both planes bravely rushed to meet the enemy. In the sky, a deadly merry-go-round began. Its opponents sought to take a favourable position for the attack, and having taken it, rushed forward. Winning determination, skill, excellent combat hardening of French pilots. Despite the numerical superiority, the fascists leave the battlefield. No one pursues them. They are running out of gasoline. We have to go back. And the pilots quickly fly to the airfield. Having returned, both excitedly report to the regiment commander about the battle. Well, what will you do with them? Laughs Timchenko. Scold them for complacency and put them in the brig. And if you think about it, you would have done the same thing yourself. Well, you can't judge the winners. Well, friends, your peaceful life is over. I say to the Frenchmen, sitting in their barracks in the evening. Tomorrow you take baptism of fire on our front. After my words in the room began something unimaginable. From solid adults, pilots turned into frolicking boys. Laughter, shouts of delight, friendly banter, all. Stop it, stop it. I laugh. Listen to the task. In a minute, 15 pairs of eyes are attentively following my pointer. I show on the map the location of the enemy resistance node, which will be struck tomorrow from the air, tell the situation. Ground units must in this area to break through the enemy defences. We support the offensive from the air and together with artillery destroy the main firing points. The task is difficult. Our pilots were well aware of this enemy node with its strong anti-aircraft cover. We also knew that attacking the object, bombers will definitely be met by fascist fighters. We need to think about everything well, and above all about the interaction of Russian pilots' bombers with the French. After all, for these few days, none of us had not advanced a single step in the field of language learning. However, it was necessary to get out of the situation. The first thing we did was to prepare a list of the most necessary commands that we would need in combat and in flight. Scribes rewrote these commands on cardboard tablets and handed out French texts, translated into Russian to the Normandy pilots, and Russian texts of commands translated into French to ours. Not to say that this was particularly original, but still now we could agree on joint actions. As soon as the tablets were ready and handed out to the pilots, we for several days practiced with them to interact in the air, studied the location of the object to be bombed. Only after making sure that people know their task perfectly, I reported to the Army headquarters on the readiness of the regiment. On the day of the flight on a combat mission, the weather fell out as if specially for raids of airships in the rear of the enemy. Spring cumulus clouds, puffy as absorbent cotton, sparkling under the bright rays of the sun, reliably hid the planes from the eyes of enemy observers. Blue window openings allowed a good observation of the ground and the detection of a given bombing target. The planes took off in groups. I led the first 9, the second, Major Dimchenko. Gathering squadrons of French fighters over the airfield was quite satisfactory. Having made a circle, we took a course to the west. I was covered by Jean-Louis Toullion with 2 quadrants of his fighters. One was commanded by himself and the other by Albert. 6 Litolf and Lefebvre covered the squadron Dimchenko. On the way, I'm preparing to give commands to Tallien and Albert. I opened the tablet, put in front of me cartons with French commands. In my heart, I curse myself that in my time I was so negligent at school about learning French. How it would come in handy now. In the classroom during training, everything went well. The Frenchmen followed my commands precisely and clearly. But what about in combat? We're flying over the spring land. Below are black forests, windings of country lanes winding through the fields. There is a slight movement on them. These are the cars, stuck at night, getting out of the mud. From the height, they look like big black beetles, concentratedly climbing on the sand. Ahead is the front line, reports the navigator. But I myself can see dark lines of enemy trenches behind Ugra, zigzags of wire fences, black thawing on firing bunkers. The enemy resistance node is the object of our bombing. We have already been noticed there. High above Ugra, shells of anti-aircraft guns are bursting. It's too early to worry the Be more attentive. Perhaps we should expect that the enemy will not limit himself to anti-aircraft fire, and so it is. On the left, directly at us, rushes 409th. From afar, the striped Messerschmitts seem to hang motionless in the air and only increase in size as they approach. Messerschmitt 109D, a good fighting machine, and when it is controlled in the air by an experienced pilot, you need to keep your ear to the ground. Enemy on the left, I give the command to everyone, and separately to the French. Cover the left. But they've already seen the enemy. Ryaki, forward. I hear Tullien's voice in my earphones. Albert and after him the others repeat the command, as if encouraging themselves. The first 4 Frenchmen boldly go into the attack, covering us from the enemy's attack. 4 red star arrows with tricolored cokes fly over our formation. The second 4 continue to protect us, watching the air. The Nazis cannot withstand the frontal attack of the French and quickly leave the battlefield. Bombers begin bombing. Black drops of bombs fall in the location of the Hitler's defences. Cameras of our planes accurately record the fountains of explosions in the area of enemy batteries and firing points. Everything seems to be in order. However, more thoroughly, we will determine the results of bombing at home when we will develop the film. Meanwhile, my 9 turns aside, giving way to Squadron Dimchenko. Just before the start of the bombing, he too is attacked by enemy fighters, but Litolf and Lefebvre turn them to flight. Dimchenko, as well as we, bombed successfully, and the regiment lies down on the reverse cure. A few minutes later, the planes, one after another, land at the airfield. The first sortie together with the French was successful. Our pilots and pilots Normandy went, proud of their victory. The trial of interaction between bombers and fighters was mostly successful. True, the habit of the French in the battle to work for themselves several times made themselves known. That one or the other pilot broke away from his pair or 4, starting an individual battle. The next day we detailed our actions in the air. Pilots Normandy pointed out their mistake, but as practice later showed, our friends did not soon abandon it, even after a few months, already interacting with the Guards Golubov regiment. Many of them, out of habit, forgot that to fight collectively is much easier and safer. Our exuberant Russian spring has finally entered its rites. The earth is warm. Fields, a few days ago black with mud, covered with young grass. In the forests, the tender foliage has rustled. But we have no time to admire nature. Combat sorties follow one after another. We must gain air superiority, and we are gaining it. The French are helping us well. Recently, Durand and Preziosi accompanied a pair of our bombers P2 bombing objects near Roslava. On the way back, they were intercepted by two Focke-Wulf 190s. Covering the pawns, Preziosi first rushes into the attack and opened fire. Focke, engulfed in flames, stone flies to the ground. The second hastily leaves. After him rushes in pursuit of Durand and hit him. All four safely return to their base. On the same day, together with the French pilots celebrate their second victory. It was won by Albert and May. True, their return was not as successful as Durand and Preziosi. Albert had to land his plane on its belly, but both pilots survived. We're having a big celebration. Our bosses have arrived, workers of the Krasnopreznensky district of the capital. We have long kept a strong connection with them. They often visit us, report on their work to our soldiers, sergeants and officers. We also give a report on their combat work to the toilers of Moscow. Strong connection front and rear helps us to fight the enemy. The chiefs arrived by automobile and stopped in a small forest, among bushes covered with bright spring greenery. "Well, how are you doing here?" asks the Chief of Staff, Colonel Tolstoy, head of the delegation, the first secretary of the district committee, Nina Vasilievna Popova, shaking his hand firmly, in a manly way, shaking his hand. "Are you beating the fascists?" Beat our pilots, my dear Nina Vasilievna, beat well," laughs the colonel. "But we can't do badly, we have to report to you. Your controllers, look how strict they are." And he waved his hand in the direction of the cars, and the inspectors were getting out of the cars with jokes and cheerful humour. They were honoured old workers of the glorious Krasnaya Presnya and young boys and girls, invisible heroes of the war, forging victory in our rear. "Yes, the controllers are good," agrees Popova. "They stay up nights at the machines, and many of them are just kids. I'm not coming to you alone today." Nina Vasilievna suddenly, as if she'd realised it, said, "I brought some more guests." She nods her head in the direction of the bus that has just arrived. "Who would you have thought?" We gasped when we saw Olle Konstantinovna Tarasova and other artists of the Moscow Art Theatre getting out of the bus. In the evening, the guests were at our division headquarters. The next day, we took the artists to the airfield Dimchenko. The meeting here was enthusiastic. The French were especially shocked. Surrounded by our guys and girls, they looked at them confusedly, often answered inappropriately. It was good that the interpreters helped. The confusion of the French had to be explained by their great modesty. They, as true heroes, did not boast of their exploits and said about themselves that they, as honest Frenchmen, only fulfilled their duty to their homeland. But our guys gave them an ovation. Especially enjoyed the attention of Major Tyulian, Lefebvre, May Albert and Preziosi, as pilots who had already managed to show their bravery and courage at our front. After the first acquaintance, the French led the Muscovites to their airplanes. The guests especially scrutinized them, counted the holes. There was a lot of laughter at Lefebvre's machine, the nose of which was painted in the form of a shark's mouth. "This is to make the Nazi pilots more afraid of me," Miss explained, smiling. "Lefebvre. They have an ace and a dragon, and I have a shark." After the inspection of the equipment, the concert began. The stage was set up in the field in car. The guests stayed until morning and left to the neighbouring regiment to Major Osipenko, and in the afternoon to the regiments of Dimchenko and Gavrilov. A few days later, our aviation made heavy strikes on enemy airfields. We bombed the enemy's facilities at the airfields in Sesha and in Bryansk. More than 500 Soviet airplanes were raised in the air. The air operation to defeat the enemy bases was successful. After it, the jackets of our pilots, including the French, were decorated with orders. We well celebrated the first awarding of our friends. At the gala dinner, not a few toasts were raised for the awardees. Not a few good wishes were expressed. Soon after the celebration, 9 Taiyan appeared over Spazdemensk. Having met the enemy fighters, the French bravely entered the battle. Victory remained on the side of the pilots of Normandy. Lieutenants May and Durand distinguished themselves again. However, that day at the airfield did not return to Bizian, Derville and Poznansky. For a long time we walked around the airfield, waiting to see if the familiar outlines of Yaks would appear on the horizon, but time was up and hopes disappeared. In addition, many of the French who took part in this battle claimed that they saw the pilots were shot down and fell to the ground. By evening, Kudiakov and I flew to Dimchenko. A long conversation with Tyulian followed. The general patiently explained to the brave French commander the reason for the death of the pilots, proved that victory is achieved not only by courage, but also by reduction. Julian smiled politely, but on his face it was clear that he did not agree, although out of respect for the general does not object. It was necessary to make a serious decision. After all, a few more such battles and Normandy will be left without pilots. The fate of the squadron was decided. It was transferred to the 303rd Division in the Guards Fighter Regiment to Golyubov. It was hard for our guys to part with the French. During these months, pilots, technicians and gunners got used to them, found a common language. The French were reluctant to part with us. What can be said but the front friendship, cemented by blood? A great nothing. General Kudyakov consoled them in farewell. We still have to fly and fly together. Today we have a very hard day. We are burying one of the oldest commanders of our division. Major Petrov, deputy regimental commander, sadly stood people in formation paying last honours to the hero officer, a group of Frenchmen headed by Major Turbulent. Having learned about the death of Petrov, they flew here from a new airfield to say goodbye to the man who taught them a lot, and above all to love their country and hate the enemy. Major Petrov died this way. On a warm June day, his group, covered by the Squadron Normandy, flew out to bombing. In a clear formation of airplanes approached the target. The enemy met the Soviet bombers' strong anti-aircraft fire. Having broken through the veil of bursts, Major Petrov ordered to prepare for bombing. The bombing began. At that moment, the group was attacked by Messerschmitts. Shooters' radiators opened heavy fire on the enemy planes. In the battle entered, and the French. Here is already one yellow-bellied, with green stripes enemy machine flashed and went to the ground. The pilots continued to bomb. Down here and there swelled clouds of black smoke. They covered the parking lots of enemy aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns continued frantic shelling, but everything was already done. The enemy airfield was almost destroyed. Petrov turned the group and led it back. The commander's plane was almost out of the zone of fire when the navigator felt how the shrapnel exploded near anti-aircraft shells hit the car. The airplane shuddered. Looking at the pilot, the officer saw that Petrov's shoulder somehow unnaturally rested against the armoured backrest of the cockpit. A stream of blood was spurting from the temple pierced by the shrapnel. The pilot was dead. The machine began to fall haphazardly. A few seconds more, and it will hit the ground. The navigator instantly reached for the steering wheel, then slipped his foot into the strap of the right pedal. Obeying the not quite sure hand of the inexperienced pilot, the airplane, waddling and swaying in the air, lay on a reverse course. But a lone machine is an easy prey for fascist fighters. Not a few seconds later, as the gunner radiator Pukov already anxiously shouted, "Merchant Commander, there are 2 fighters on the right," to knock the enemy out of the sight. Navigator later told me, I did the most unthinkable maneuvers and turns with a decrease. And the fascist vultures, having smelled a sure prey, persistently continued their attacks. It was good that Pukov drove them away from the plane with accurate bursts. Knocking sharp maneuvers of the enemy from the sight, the navigator drove the car to the front line. A little more, and he will be over his territory. At that moment, Pukov reported that he saw on the counter course for Yakovlev. It was returning French pilots who rushed to the aid of a bomber in trouble. They bravely attacked enemy fighters. One Messerschmitt was hit. The second quickly disappeared behind the clouds. Late in the evening, the plane, piloted by the navigator, approached the boundaries of the airfield. Here it was met with fire their anti-aircraft gunners, taking our car for the enemy scout Messerschmitt 110. From afar, their silhouettes were similar to each other. "I'm my plane, USETF." Shooting stopped. It was necessary to land, and the navigator did not know how to do it. From the ground, he was ordered to move away from the airfield and jump with a parachute. The crew landed successfully. A little later, the navigator and gunner radiator were at headquarters and told how Major Petrov died. Farewell salute salvos sounded loudly over the native forest. Soon we will move from this airfield to another, leaving here a low hill of earth, under which lies the body of our friend, but none of us will never forget him, because, as Jean-Louis Tallien said when bidding him farewell, he was a man of great heart. Saying so, the courageous commander of the Normandy did not know that soon we will mourn his death. A few days later, Major Turbulent, attacking the enemy airfield, was hit and directed his plane into the enemy vehicles standing on the field. In May I was called to Kozels. There was an airfield of the 18th Guards Regiment of Fighter Aviation. In short, I flew to Golubov. It turns out that he is a guest of French General Petit, who at that time headed the French military mission in Moscow. His arrival was associated with the inspection of the Squadron Normandy. In addition, he brought awards to the most distinguished French pilots. His arrival turned into a real celebration. At first, Normandy held a kind of parade in the air. The French carried over the airfield, showing his general excellent flying skills. The representative of the French command was satisfied with the flight training of their, as he put it, guys. Indeed, the pilots performed admirably, but we knew that in real combat they work much better. After the flights, everyone went to the mess hall for a gala dinner. Here General Petit presented awards to Captain Litov and Albert. Then again toasts were raised. At first, the glasses were Russian front, slightly smelling of gasoline. Then there were French wines. They were brought with General Petit. The evening passed in a friendly, warm way. September 1943. Indian summer. In the forest's thin aspens are burning brighter and brighter with yellow-red fire. In spite of gunfire and shooting in the sky, migratory birds are stretching southward along the old routes. We fly too, but our routes are new. The Soviet army, having broken the enemy resistance, is advancing on Smolensk. On the ground, our troops have already liberated Yelnya and are successfully advancing westward. We've had some changes in command. The Air Army received Colonel General of Aviation Mikhail Mikhailovich Gromov, a pilot known to the whole country, hero of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan to Mandus tasked for the division, a number of successive bombing strikes to defeat the enemy aviation at its largest airfields. The first in line was Borovskoy. I called to me the scout of the division, Lieutenant Anisimov. We sat with him a lot of time, clarifying the task, and it was not easy. Anisimov had to gather information about the airfield in Borovskoy within a few days. In the morning, the scout took to the air. By lunchtime, he returned, handed over the pictures, and flew away again. For the next 3 days, the lieutenant flew several times a day. As a result of these flights, we clarified that twice a week. By 13 o'clock, Hitler writes, "Fly to Borovskoy." For what purpose? It is not known. But at these hours, the airfield was crowded. The information is tempting. However, the message of the scout required verification. Painfully unbelievable that the enemy in broad daylight brings its aviation in one place. He could do it in 1941, but true, Borovskoy, according to the information I had, was well covered by anti-aircraft fire and fighter. We requested the front headquarters to check the information gathered by our pilot through the headquarters of the partisan movement. Soon the confirmation came from there. Anisimov, as always, was right. Now it was possible to fully develop the operation to defeat the enemy airfield. After sitting without sleep for 2 days, the headquarters prepared the development. It was decided to make a raid in the daytime, attack the enemy unexpectedly, when he is not waiting for us, blocking beforehand his airfield. The army commander approved our plan. On September 12, the commander of the fighter division, General Zakharov, came to see me. "Well, neighbor," he greeted me. "Are we bombing Borovskoy?" "We will," I answered, "if your men support us." "My men will support us, don't worry. You will go together with your old acquaintances, and by the way, with your pupils. I'll send all my men in the Normandy. I think they can manage." Leaning back in his chair, Zakharov took out a cigarette case and smoked. Before lunch, he and I outlined all the stages of interaction. After a quick snack, Zakharov hurried off. "It's time, brother, to go home. Tomorrow I'll send Golubov and Poyard to you. With them you will make a final agreement." Waving his helmet, Zakharov went to the plane. A few minutes later, his Lay-5 disappeared behind the forest. In the morning came Golubov and Poyard, who replaced the dead Taoyan. Again a meeting, but now with all the commanders of regiments. Then the second with pilots. It was agreed that we will strike tomorrow at precisely 13 o'clock, and that was the end of it. All night and all morning engineers and technicians checked airplanes. Gunners hung bombs. Before the flight, everything was finalized. It is the first to rise from their airfield pilots of the 18th Golubov Regiment and the French. In order not to get on the wave of enemy locators, fighters went on a shaving flight, almost above the ground. In terms of skill, it was the most remarkable fighter raid that I had to hear about during the entire war. Imagine for a moment the swift speed of the Yaks going almost above the ground. Here it is enough for a pilot to hesitate or get confused for a fraction of a second, and his airplane will smash into a hill or a tree. Excellent, but somewhat eerie skill. The Nazis were dumbfounded when they saw the Red Star fighters over the airfield. The locators had not warned the airfield, and therefore the enemy anti-aircraft facilities were silent. As a thunder of clear sky, our planes crashed on the fascist airfield, pouring lead on the airplanes standing on the ground. A large air base of Hitlerites this time was completely blocked. Soviet fighters did not give the enemy planes a chance to get out from under the blow. True, some of the fascists tried to take off from one of the sectors of the airfield, but nothing came out of it. Even on the ground, they were attacked by pilots of Zemarin's squadron who shot down 2 airplanes. The same failure was suffered by a group of Hitlerites in another sector. While attempting to taxi for takeoff, it was attacked and destroyed by French pilots under the command of Lieutenants Marcel Albert, Barbier and Lefebvre. In order to save their planes at Borovsky Airfield, the Nazis requested help from neighbouring airfields. In a few minutes, 2 groups of fighters Mi-109 and ep.1 appeared on the battlefield. A fierce fight ensued. However, superiority in numbers was on our side. Squadrons Sibirin and Zamorin together with the French attacked the enemy. Fascist pilots had nothing to do but hurriedly leave. At this moment, over the enemy airfield appeared a compound of P-2. The planes went in 2 large groups. The first was led by Lieutenant Colonel Timchenko, the second, Lieutenant Colonel Gavrilov. The approach of the 1st Regiment lasted less than a minute, the same amount of time spent in Gavrilov. By the second approach of our bombers, enemy anti-aircraft gunners, apparently, a little came to their senses. In the air flashed bursts of anti-aircraft shells, but it did not help. Bombs fell on airplane parking lots, on anti-aircraft batteries, airfield facilities, gasoline depots and bomb stores. Over the fields and forests stretched clouds of fiery black smoke. Below, everything was burning, crackling, exploding, illuminating the sky with purple spores. In the evening, we struck the Borovsk airfield again, and again we were covered by pilots of the 18th Regiment and the French. Hot summer days. The Soviet army successfully develops the offensive in Belarusia, having broken out into the operational space. Motorized infantry and tankers are rapidly advancing. We, pilots, also have to roam from one airfield to another. The clear interaction of aviation with ground troops requires us to be close to the infantry, as our pilot said then, laughing. In these days of the offensive, our pilots showed a lot of courage and high skill in battles with the enemy. Despite the huge successes of ground troops, the Nazis continue to stubbornly resist not only on the ground, but also in the air. Air battles, as a rule, were brutal and bloody. By this time, both we and the pilots of the Normandy suffered irrecoverable loss. While performing a combat mission, fell to the death of the brave commander of the bomber regiment, Major Markov. July 16, 1943, in the squadron Normandy died Captain Litov, and just a day before that in the area of Znamenskaya heroically died Major Tuyuryan. To replace the fallen heroes' pilots came young people, stubborn, courageous, not knowing fear in battle, always ready to help their comrades. In those days, among the fighter pilots and our bombers was a well-known tragic case, which occurred with the French pilot Desagne. We all admired the courage and heroism of this man. I first learned the details of his death from the division commander, General Zakharov. Here is what he told. In one of the sunny days, pilots Normandy flew to a new airfield. The airplanes were boiling with excitement. There were jokes and laughter. They gathered for a short time and therefore took with them only the necessary. Together with everyone was preparing for the flight Lieutenant Desagne. He was a very interesting man. He came from an old noble family. His compatriots called him a baron. I don't know if Desagne was really a baron, but he was a fine man, and most importantly, very brave, which was especially appreciated at the front. Now he was going to fly his plane together with mechanic Belozub. It must be said that, despite the difference in origin and views on politics between these two people, French nobleman aristocrat and Russian working boy, established a warm friendship. Belozub took very careful care of his pilot's airplane. It was enough in time not to return Desagne to the airfield, as his mechanic was already anxiously looking at the sky, trying to notice the familiar contours of the plane. When the Frenchman returned, Belozub could stay up all night long, preparing the lieutenant's plane for the next combat mission. Desagne also treated his mechanic warmly in a friendly manner. My Frenchman, though a baron, but smart, Belozub often told his comrades, "This day, mechanic Belozub, as many times before, climbed into the fuselage of the airplane without taking a parachute. It was not far to fly, and with a parachute in the fuselage cannot be placed. The signal was given for the next group to take off. Together with all Desain took to the air, heading for a new airfield. The plane went low over the forest so as not to attract the attention of enemy fighters. Over one of the woods where the grouping of Hitlerites was surrounded, Desain fired from the ground. Incendiary bullets set fire to the engine. The airplane burst into flames. But despite the fire, the pilot stubbornly continued to drive the car, trying to get to the airfield. It's not so far away. It will be possible to go to land. And at this time at the airfield, confusion. The commander of the Normandy, Louis Delfino, seeing that the plane Desaino, embraced by the flames, ordered him to jump with a parachute. "I cannot, my commander," replied Desain. "May I have a Soviet mechanic Belozub with me? He has no parachute. I'll try to land." The excited Frenchman stepped away from the microphone. He was shocked by the drama that was playing out in the sky. He was replaced by Soviet engineer Major Agavlian. First in French and then in Russian, he ordered Desain to leave the plane. But it happens that sometimes the power of simple human friendship is stronger than an order. The French pilot Desain did not obey this order either. In mortal danger, he did not leave his Soviet friend. Several times Desain tried to shoot down the flames and by all means make a landing, but without success. Fire and smoke prevented him from making a proper approach. From the ground continuously followed commands on the radio. Desain, take the right. His chief of staff, Major Vetovin, and engineer Agavlian made every effort to save the crew. Burning airplane then flew straight into the forest, then, turning around, again tried to get on the landing strip. Finally, the commander of the regiment of Soviet fighters and Major Louis Delfino, seeing the futility of the pilot's desperate attempts to save the life of his mechanic, transmitted a joint order: immediately leave the plane and jump alone. But Desain did not respond. The final approach, and the plane crashed into the ground. The heroic Frenchman sacrificed his life trying to save his Russian friend. Not much time passed, and we in our regiments began to talk about a new episode, showing the friendship of our guys with the French. In the battle over one of the settlements in East Prussia, Messerschmitt shot down a Soviet bomber. The pilot, Lieutenant Yakubov, began to descend by parachute. At that time, the Normandy pilot, Lieutenant Nier, who was covering Yakubov, was also shot down. The Frenchman also ejected by parachute. They descended in the neutral zone. May had both legs broken. The Russian officer did not leave his French friend in trouble. Despite heavy fire, he shouldered his wounded comrade and crawled to our trenches. "It seemed to me that I would never get out of this scorcher," Yakubov said later. "Bullets whistled over my head like a cloud of bees. I thought of only one: how to save the Frenchman. Several times Eamon asked me to leave him and save myself, but I didn't understand a word of French, and even if I did, I would never have done it. I continued to crawl forward, carefully sheltering my comrade from enemy bullets. Having crossed the heights, I found myself at our wire fences. A little more, and I got into the trench of one of the rifle companies of the battalion defending here. From here we were both transported to the unit. For saving the French officer, I was awarded the Order of France, Combat Cross. On May 28, 1944, in the area of Vitebex, for some unknown reason, the plane of our common favourite pilot Lefebvre, who was returning from a combat mission, caught fire. The brave pilot in gasoline-soaked clothes still managed to reach the airfield and land the machine. Disaster struck a minute later when the pilot opened the cockpit lantern and air rushed in. Lefebvre burst into flames. Jumping out of the airplane, he began rolling on the ground, trying to douse the flames. Soldiers rushed to his aid, but it was too late. Burned Lefebvre urgently sent to the Moscow military hospital, where he died a few days later in the arms of Captain Delfino. The Frenchman was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The Soviet offensive continued. Minsk had already been taken. Our infantry and tanks were approaching the Niemen. Not giving the enemy a break, our troops pursued the Hitlerites, throwing them out of the limits of the native Soviet land. And we are already flying further. The task was set: to block from the air the capital of Lithuania, Kaunas. Fighters and we, bombers, do not know a minute of rest. On the approaches to Kaunas, we do not often have to meet our friends Rajaks. They are now more active in the free hunt for fascist airplanes. The fame of the French heroes is spreading all over the front. The exploits of our Ryaks are closely intertwined with the exploits of Soviet pilots, and we heartily rejoice at the success of our friends. At the beginning of August, it became known that for the courage and bravery of the personnel in providing from the air, forcing our troops to the Neman, the regiment Normandy received the honorary name of Niemen. Henceforth it will be called the Normandy-Neman Regiment. The awarding of the regiment is like a confirmation of old merits, for which on February 24, 1944, Normandy was awarded the oldest order of our motherland, the Order of the Red Banner of Battle. Same fall of 1944. The war has already crossed the border of East Prussia. The troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front under the command of General Cherniakovsky broke the resistance of Hitlerites on the state border and started fighting on the Prussian land. In these days, our aviation had a lot of work. We bombed fortified positions of the enemy from Suwalki to Shervand. One of the first bombing flew out a connection of bombers of General Tuchev. They were covered by Golubov's regiment and the French. The first target, the airfield Juxtion. Guardsmen of the 18th Fighter Regiment and French pilots distinguished themselves then. They flew out to cover the 2nd Tank Corps, which was on the offensive against a large fortified knot of Hitler's defences. Not flying to the target, Golubov noticed on the horizon 50 Junkers 88. They were accompanied by a large group of fighters. Soviet pilots went on the attack. Pilot Serezhin and his comrades split the line of enemy bombers. The battle began. Whirlwind centres of fights quickly moved from one place to another. In this battle fearlessly acted pilots Danilenko, Barsukov and Repik. While on the first floor was fighting with bombers, the 1st Squadron of Hero of the Soviet Union, Guards Major Sibirin and fighters of the Regiment Normandy-Neman and attacked Focke-Wulf's 190, which accompanied their bombers. As Golubov told me later, it was a gorgeous battle. It lasted only 5 minutes. But what meant speedy, maneuverable, perfectly armed Yak-3, flown by such masters of air combat as Sibirin and Zamorin, De La Poype and Risso, Pinchuk and Andrei, Zapaskin and Marcel Albert, carried in the air as winged avengers. Multicoloured tracks crossed the sky now and then. In this battle, 5 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the first minutes of the battle. Major Golubov carefully watched his subordinates. Here the pilot Repikov, fascinated by the fight, pursues the enemy plane. He does not see that in the tail of his goes Fokker. The pilot's death is inevitable. A brave regiment commander rushes to the aid of his subordinate. A short attack, fire from close range, and set on fire Focke-Wulf falls to the ground. Repikov can continue the fight. At this time, a new group of French pilots is approaching. Now the advantage is fully on our side. The enemy is almost no longer resisting. One after another enemy pilots are trying to cling to the ground and leave. Thus, the joint efforts of our and French pilots were thwarted star raid of enemy aviation, with the help of which Hitler's command wanted to disrupt the offensive of our tank corps. On that day, Golubov's pilots and the Normandy-Neman Regiment shot down 48 enemy planes without losing a single man. February 5, we bombed Königsberg. Together with Soviet fighters, we are again covered by old friends Ryaks, pilots of the Squadron Normandy-Neman. The raid was very successful, despite the fact that the enemy anti-aircraft artillery was very active this time. Already on the approaches to the objects of the bombers met a barrage of Nazi anti-aircraft batteries. Focke-Wulf's appeared without delay. However, we had already accumulated considerable experience in blocking enemy airfields, and we successfully coped with this task. In this battle, the French lost Lieutenant Pona, one of the young pilots who had arrived at our front not so long ago. We also lost someone. When we bombed Nazi targets on the Niemen River, our combat commander Major Zaitsev died. We buried him in the cemetery in Kaunas. March 19. On the roads to Königsberg there is impenetrable mud. Tanks, cars, people are struggling to get forward. Hitler's citadel in East Prussia is completely surrounded by our troops. The garrison command is making incredible efforts to break out of the encirclement, but it's impossible. The enemy is locked firmly. These days we are actively supporting the actions of ground units. Over the fighting order of the Nazis now and then appear our attack aircraft and bombers. The actions of attack and bomber aviation reliably support the fighter pilots of the 303rd Guards Fighter Division and the French. April 3 and 4, we desperately bombing Königsberg. The enemy is finally suppressed by our aviation. Communication in the garrison has then told the head of the Königsberg garrison, Hitler's General Laisch, Was in the first days of bombing completely destroyed. Our pilots managed to paralyze the enemy defense in the forts. On April 9, 1945, Königsberg fell. Soviet divisions rushed to the last stronghold of Hitlerites in East Prussia, the port. Here, in one of the battles, the French pilot Lieutenant François de Joffre was shot down by the enemy fighter. The battle took place over the Frischgarf Bay. The airplane, followed by the pilot himself, fell into the water. Only 2 weeks ago freed from. For many hours, the officer was in the water. His excellent athletic training saved him. François de Joffre swam like a fish. In the dead of night, exhausted from fatigue, he almost swam to the shore. But then his strength left him and he began to sink. The French officer was noticed by Russian soldiers. One of them bravely threw himself into the icy water and swam towards de Joffre. Half an hour later, the French pilot was already sitting in the dugout of the commander of the rifle battalion in a mug of hot tea, well flavoured with 90-degree alcohol. In April 25, we bombed Pillow for the last time. In the air, the bombers were reliably supported by fighters Golubov and groups of pilots Delfino. This was the last sortie Normandy-Neman. At noon on the Spitfreschnering, all quieted down. In the centre of the city on the buildings blazed red flags. East Prussia is cleared of Hitlerites. Columns of captured Nazi soldiers are wandering along the wet, broken roads. Often at the crossroads you can meet large groups of people. Men from under black and grey coats look out, striped canvas pants. Women are also dressed monotonously. Their faces are all grey and thin. Their eyes burn with excited fire. These are prisoners of German concentration camps, surrounded by our fighters. They tell about the horrors they had to endure. Guys stick them bread and sugar. They thank them and immediately sink their teeth into hard pieces of soldiers' bread. A few days after the capture of Pillow, the pilots of Normandy-Neman flew to Moscow to return home. This was the end of our joint combat work, but the front friendship did not end. 7 times was marked Regiment Normandy. Neman in the orders of the Supreme Command. 4 pilots, Marcel Lefebvre, Markel Albert, Caves André, Roland de la Poix, were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. French patriots made a worthy contribution to the common victory, in the name of which the Soviet soldiers and the entire Soviet country bore the brunt of the Great Patriotic War. In the days of severe military trials, the high patriotism of the Soviet people, courage and military skill of our soldiers served as an example for all how to defend the honor and independence of their homeland. We, apparently, until our last hour will remember the wonderful, courageous people, pilots of the squadron Normandy-Neman, who fought wing to wing with our pilots for the great victory over fascism. Many years have passed. Many readers, of course, will be interested in the future fate of the heroes discussed in the book. Some of them after the war visited the Soviet Union, but I was not able to meet with them, which I regret very much. But one warm August evening I received a call from Major General Ustinov, editor-in-chief of the newspaper Soviet Aviation. He asked me to stop by and see him. "I have a surprise for you. He finished the invitation. Be sure to come." I shrugged my shoulders in bewilderment. What kind of surprise can we talk about? However, I got dressed and went to Maslovka, where the editorial office was located at that time. They are waiting for me there. Walking down the long corridor, I open the door to the editor's office and stop in surprise. On the chair next to General Golubov, I see the familiar face of François de Joffre. He smiles and walks towards me. We shake hands firmly. De Joffre is visiting us. He will be vacationing on the Black Sea coast. That evening we sat in the newsroom for a long time. De Joffre asked us about his friends, the Russian pilots with whom he had fought during the war. By the way, he asked if we knew the surname of that Russian soldier who had thrown himself after him into the cold water of the Frischgarf and saved him from death. In this respect, neither I nor Golubov could help our friend. The name of the brave warrior is as yet unknown to us. If he reads these lines, let him inform us of himself. From de Joffre, we learned about the fate of some Frenchman. Hero of the Soviet Union, Viscount de la Poix is now preparing in France a cadre of young pilots. Marchi, Amage, Emone, Maria, Janelle, Carbon and some others are serving in some military, others civilian. De Joffre himself retired from the army. Lack of seniority and youth made him ineligible for a pension. He had to get a job. At one time he served in Asia as a pilot on rubber plantations, then in Venezuela, a pilot at the geological detachment. Both CAT, yes. I was looking for gold, but I didn't get rich, he laughs. Now, as I understood him, he is more engaged in literature. His book Normandy Niemann was published in France, in which he tells about how French pilots fought on the Soviet-German front. In military aviation are now serving Cufo and Jacques-André. The handsome Marcel Albert, according to Diafra, married favourably and went to America. General Petit, who headed the French military mission in Moscow during the war, now heads the France-USSR Society and is well known in our country as a courageous patriot and a convinced supporter of Franco-Soviet friendship. Soviet people have deep feelings of friendship and respect for the glorious people of France, for its heroic sons who fought against Hitler's invaders for their homeland in the skies of Russia. When asked by the Frenchman what we know about Russian pilots, I told him that the regiment commander Lieutenant Colonel Dimchenko, Navigator Krustkov, Chief Engineer of the Division Engineer Colonel Zakhanov, Navigator Armashov, Lieutenant Arkhipov left the army after the war. All of them work in production. Hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel Martinov, Regiment Commander Gavrilov are now generals and continue to serve in the army. In the Army hero of the Soviet Union, former Major, and now Major General Alexander Medvedev, Major General Gobov and Major General Zakharov, like myself, are in the reserve. They live in Moscow and are always happy to see their French friends. We meet with these people quite often. Last time, at the festive table, we had this idea. It would be good for the veterans of the division to gather in Moscow every year. We decided to hold the meeting on Pushkin Square, at the monument to the great Russian poet, on the first Sunday of May. I would like to dream that at one of these meetings together with us will be someone from the regiment Normandy Niemann. We will shake hands and sing our favourite song, the song about the Squadron Normandy. And how good that song is. I'll come to Paris. I'll go to all the houses. I'll go under the ground. I'll find a Normandy pilot there. We'll continue our old conversation. We fought for what was right, camaraderie. We hate any other kind of war. Don't be deceived, Frenchman. And keep your oath. We've flown alone in the skies. We've lost friends in battle. And to those who have lived, we must remember them and be friends. This is a song of friendship. It is cemented by hot soldiers' blood, spilled in battles against fascism in the name of peace and happiness of nations. We must always remember its words.